Star Minigaming YouTube video. This is another video in our Tactica series, and this one I want to have more of a broader topic that I'm just going to discuss, and that's dealing with opponents' casters, especially if you don't have any for yourself. In a recent game that I played, actually in two recent games, it's been my caster versus my opponent's caster, and when I say caster, I'm referring not necessarily just to wizards in general, but the ones that are bigger threats that can do multiple things, like summoning especially. And so as, you know, a Death Faction player, and I was playing against a friend of mine who was borrowing my Lizardman force, we both had summoning units on the field, right? I had Vlad and Arcan the Black, and he had a Slann, and so every single turn both of us were able to summon reinforcements. And, you know, that against an army like Stormcast or Empire, or, you know, if you're playing any of these armies that don't have the ability to summon, it can seem a bit daunting to try to deal with an opponent that can continue to replenish their numbers on the battlefield, especially if the scenario that you're playing is somewhat affected by, you know, kind of like the ability of your opponent to slowly grind you down or whatever. Especially if you are facing a Death Faction player like myself, like, the best thing that we can do is grind you down. There's probably no faction in the game better suited for that long, drawn-out kind of siege-esque warfare than the Death Faction, because you knock it down and it will just stand it right back up. And so, you know, I'm not going to cover real super extensive in terms of like every army and what they can do. I'm only going to mention a few that you know, I personally know people that play these factions, and I know that they're fairly common factions, and the principles that I talk about for them will apply to other armies. Just the specific units that I reference won't necessarily be usable if you play an army outside of what I mentioned. So, you know, first off, we have the Stormcast, who are a pretty popular faction, at least in the area that I live, and in part I think that's because there's such a high percentage of brand new players to the Warhammer fantasy realm, myself included. It's at best guess, just based upon like the tournaments I've been to and the people that I've met, it's probably close to 65 to 75% of the total population of local Age of Sigmar players are brand new to the Warhammer fantasy kind of world. And so quite a few of them play the Stormcasts, and for the Stormcasts, you really have a difficult situation because you are an elite army, right? You field smaller numbers than most other armies, but at a, you know, individual troop level, you probably have some of the best units in the game. That can go toe-to-toe with just about anybody else one-on-one. And, you know, the problem with that being, if you're facing an army like the Death Faction, like if I bring a pretty standard list that I would bring against you, you're going to be facing, you know, like large mobs of zombies and skeletons and things like that that have the ability to basically stand back up every turn based upon the you know, totem banners that they'll bring, or you know, Death Wizards just resummoning them whenever they get killed or knocked down, and the fact that in those kinds of units that are so swarm-based that can just keep standing back up, that they get lots of benefits for being larger squads as well. So like you know, even a unit of 20 skeletons is quite dangerous to a smaller group of liberators, say. You know, you have five liberators in a group, well, those 20 skeletons are something that they'll probably beat in a prolonged combat, but it's something that can certainly wear them down, and it's not out of the realm of, you know, reasonable probability that they could in fact kill those 5 liberators by themselves. So it's something that you have to be concerned about. You know, as an elite army, every loss that you take is far more significant. Like, every individual model that you lose is far more significant than obviously a swarm-based army that has so many more. Especially with summoners, as they have, you know, theoretically an unlimited horde to continue to throw at you. So with the Stormcast, there's a few ways that you can deal with it. Number one, and the easiest, is of course the Celestant Prime. you can just bring him, you start him in reserve, you can in essence deep strike him anywhere onto the battlefield outside of 9 inches of an enemy. And the turn that he arrives, it counts as his movement for the turn, but he still has his special like Comet Strike Scepter that has a shooting ability where you can inflict mortal wounds automatically. I'm not saying without rolling to hit, but in that same turn you can inflict mortal wounds onto your opponent's summoning caster. You also have the option of certain formations allow your Stormcast to basically deep strike into the battle. And barring all that, you always have the option of your prosecutors. Probably the greatest thing in the game for eliminating opposing summoners is flying units. You can just go right over the units that they summon to basically defend themselves with. The prosecutors are really good because they have the ability to throw either their hammers or their javelins or their trident before they enter combat, so you have the chance that while you're moving up to potentially inflict wounds before you're even within charge range, and then you charge on 3d6 with them, so an up to 18-inch charge range. So there's certainly nothing to to ignore if you're on the kind of defensive end of that with your summoner. Prosecutors can be a threat. And obviously, having other units like Retributors, especially against swarm-based armies, Retributors and the other Paladins are quite good, and Liberators to kind of hold the line, and Judicators to thin them down where you need to, is a big deal, and you definitely want to combine all those kinds of things to where you have your more rank-and-file line infantry to kind of tie up the things that they summon and to contain them, while your Judicators, if they have range and line of sight, can certainly do it, or your prosecutors really go to town on that summoner. And the most important thing with any of these factions is take out the summoner as quick as you can, because if you eliminate their ability to summon more units, most of the armies, I'm not saying all of them, most of the armies that use summoning quite heavily, if you take that out very quickly, then they are at a significant disadvantage to you if you're playing any kind of remotely balanced game. And if you're not, if you're playing more of a scenario that's more thematic to like a story kind of thing, where the forces are less equally balanced, taking out the caster really quickly helps to take away your opponent's biggest advantage over you as the Stormcast player, or really any of these factions. The second faction I wanted to briefly touch on was the Empire. And if you play as the Empire, you have a ridiculous number of ways that you can deal with opposing summoners. Any faction in the game that has access to any kind of ranged weaponry, whether it's bows, crossbows, guns, pistols, cannons, anything, that's a good way that you can deal with your opponent's caster, or at least force them to be quite far back on the table to where they're limited in their mobility. But the Empire has so many siege weapons like the Hailstorm rockets and the mortar and the cannons and all these other kinds of siege weapons, the steam tanks. You have a plethora of ways to deal with this. If you're an Empire player and you are routinely losing to opponents who have summoners and are unable to deal with their summoners, then quite frankly you need to take a step back and look at fielding some units or using these units properly. They're basically designed to counter that kind of unit. Most summoners and most casters in general have a pretty low wound total, and typically, not always, typically don't have as high of saves. So your rend will be more significant, or if you can inflict mortal wounds, even better, right? Take them down pretty quickly. But the one that I want to talk about, because I don't really have much interest in the Empire, I don't like most of their aesthetics, but I'm tempted to get a very small group of Empire models just to kind of laser beam Death Star my way around the table. And with that, I'm talking about the Lumiarch of Hush, or Heish, or however it's pronounced, with the Searing Beam of Light. It's a 30-inch range, 1 attack, 3 to hit, 3 to wound, a rend of -2. So against most casters, they're either not having saves anymore or saving on a 5-up or a 6-up or something in the neighborhood of that. And if it has taken no wounds in the game, which you're trying to kill the enemy's caster early on in the game, so I would assume that that'd be the case, it has 6 damage. So if you successfully hit with that giant death ray, that opponent's caster is probably dead. There are very few casters in the game, unless they're mounted on a monster like Arcan the Black or the other Mortarks or a Nagash type level character that can withstand 6 wounds and still be on the table. Now, there's ways that can be impacted, but one of my personal favorites is if you combine that with the Hurricanum, because then you add the +1 to the hit, and then there's other units that you can take that will buff your to wounds, so you can make that really manageable by relatively simple combos to realistically get that hit far more often than not, the hit and the wound rolls to succeed. But the giant death laser is definitely appealing to me. Clearly, if you're the death faction, you have probably one of the easiest times dealing with opponents' summoners. For example, if you do what I did in not the most recent game I played, but the one before that, and you bring the Malignance Battalion War Scroll, then you gain the ability to pick up your Hex Wraiths or your Spirit Hosts and from anywhere on the battlefield and teleport them over to your Mortis engine, and then they can move, because this takes place during the hero phase and it doesn't take away their movement. They can move and charge normally. So the big thing with that is that I killed my opponent's caster in 1 turn with that. Not turn 1, but once I kind of moved into position, which I think was like turn 2 or 3, and I kind of decided let's deal with this now. It was really easy because every one of those models in that formation is a flying unit, right? And so you can very easily set, and it's another nice thing too, because if your opponent's not consciously thinking about it the entire time, it's easy to kind of lull them into a false sense of security, because the Mortis engine is not a bad unit, but it's not an amazingly powerful unit in its own right. It has great potential for damage that it can inflict, but the statistical odds of that are pretty low, of that happening in any given turn. But anyways, because you can take your Hex Wraiths, which I would recommend over the Spirit Host, simply because it's an easier time for them to inflict the damage than the Spirit Host, the amount of damage that you're going to need to kill an opponent's caster in 1 turn with this. But you can move up the Mortis engine in the previous turns and get it into a good position, and then you can teleport the Hex Wraiths over during your hero phase, and then move them, and they move 12 inches, and they're flyers, so they just go whoop right over the enemy, and then you can of course charge afterwards. And so realistically there's a very large amount of space. 24 inches is clearly the maximum that you're going to get in 1 turn with the Hex Wraiths in terms of movement and charging without any other kind of bonus added to it. But it's not difficult to get yourself in a position that in under that you can charge your opponent's caster and kill them in 1 turn, because the Hex Wraiths have enough attacks and wound easily enough and do have a rend that it's not that difficult for them to inflict, in a small group of 5 or 6 or so, to inflict the 5 or 6 wounds that you typically need to kill your opponent's summoning unit. So that's all for this little Tactica video. I just wanted to, kind of help people figure out ways and kind of get past that whole boogeyman mentality of summoning. I don't believe summoning's overpowered in Age of Sigmar. I've never had a problem with dealing with it personally. And another way, really, that I was just thinking of before I go, that any faction can do, is if you have 2 realm gates on the field. If you get in position near one, even if your opponent's caster isn't nearby the other one, you can just walk through it with the unit and then teleport onto the other side of the battlefield, because you can come in near any of the table edges or the other realm gate. So really, it's not that difficult to deal with summoners, but it's just getting past that boogeyman mentality and having the right mindset of, this is how I deal with them. I need to hit them quick. I need to hit them early to remove that advantage for my opponent. Because if you do leave them alone and you just try to, barrel your way straight through your opponent and all the stuff that they're summoning, more often than not, it will be incredibly difficult for you, and you will slowly be ground down by the reinforcements that they're able to summon every single turn. But I hope that helps. I hope that, helps you figure out how to maybe beat that guy that's been winning with his caster against you as of late. But until next time, this is James, and happy gaming.